Welcome to the Media Roundtable Industry Edition. If you've been keeping up with us, we've spent the last few years talking to leading voices in podcasts about what they create, why they create it, and the impact they want to have on the world. This is a true roundtable format. And like we say in the name, this is our industry edition. So it's going to be less focused on creators and more about how media and audio industry experts can adapt to the news of the day. Today, I'm your host, Stu Redwine, VP of Creative Services at Oxford Road, and I'm joined by my fellow agents of influence. First up, we've got a special guest this week, Alyssa Myers, reporter at Morning Brew's Marketing Brew newsletter. How you doing, Alyssa?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me on.
We're also joined by Kristen Duenes, Associate Media Director at Oxford Road.
Hey, everyone. Glad to be back.
And Neil Lucy, EVP, Strategy and Product at Oxford Road.
Hi, everybody.
And last but certainly not least, the one, the only, James Ingracia, EVP, Client Services at Oxford Road.
Glad to be here for the first time.
Happy to have you here. I'm so excited. So Alyssa, Kristen, Neil, James, welcome to the Media Roundtable. First up this week, from our special guests, we have a story. Podcasters are buying millions of listeners through mobile game ads. Alyssa, what is that all about?
Yeah, this was an interesting story that kind of reemerged, I would say, last week or a couple weeks ago relative to podcasts. Bloomberg's Ashley Carman did this big look at how some major podcast networks are essentially paying for in-game advertisement. So if you're playing a game like Subway Surfers is the big example, you might see an ad for a podcast and the podcast would start downloading, or maybe you hear some of it. And there's obviously questions about that, about does that constitute as a real download? How do advertisers feel about that? And the thing I'd want to add on that is that it's actually not super unique to podcasting alone. Digital news publishers do this. My colleague Ryan wrote about it in August, about how companies like Vanity Fair and the LA Times are also working with apps like Subway Surfers and doing what's called rewarded inventory, basically, where people play these games. And in order for them to get extra lives or points or something like that, they would have to read a certain amount of an article from these publishers. So it's a tactic that is not unique to podcasting, but definitely reemerged in the context of podcasting, thanks to Ashley's story.
Yeah, and it's that perennial question, right, of what is a download when it comes to podcasting, something we're still working on answering. James, I know you had a point of view on this.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, Alyssa. It's definitely a practice that many people from the dawn of the internet have engaged in. And it was unfortunate to see the article, to be honest, last week, as we all saw it through a number of publishers that we work with. However, when we really sat back and thought about it, we realized, well, we're a performance agency. So there's a reason why some of these networks that are named here, their ads simply don't work. And it could be as a result of this. So as a performance agency, when we have clients who put money into testing new shows or new hosts or new different reads that might be in there, if it doesn't perform, we don't renew it. So these companies that are engaging in this practice, while they are inflating their impressions and gaining traction probably faster than an organic way, they are losing out on direct response media dollars because the performance just isn't there. All that's there is impressions. While that might be appealing to some clients and some advertisers, it definitely is not to ours.
You know, it's interesting for me to look at this because the way I see it is it's an excuse to get the downloads up for advertisers to pay for it. And it's an excuse for independent podcasters to, sell their podcast to some of the bigger networks, right? Because we're seeing podcasts sell their shows, or at least the sales portion of it, to big networks like Wondery or, Amazon, which is Wondery, Premiere. For those impressions to be up means that they can justify higher rates and better sales. But what at the end of the day, for us performance marketers, it doesn't end up panning out. So it's kind of like the emperor has no clothes situation. Which I think in the end is going to be really, really unfortunate now that we're, taking back the hood and saying like, well, what is this actually? What are the real numbers from this? We're going to have to look at these shows that maybe cost a little bit more based off of like these false downloads and say, well, we were paying this, but it's actually only worth this, because performance is not coming in for these performance marketers, and we're not seeing those conversions. And it's because some of these impressions are so false. And you could say like, well, it only affects performance marketers, but it's actually affecting a lot of the reach brand marketers as well, because their ads are not getting heard, right? Because these are small snippets of audio being played, and it's not getting to that ad portion. So even for somebody who's just trying to expand their reach, it's not real. They're not getting heard. It's not helping their brand. So it's hurting everybody across the board. And at the end of the day, it's going to hurt the podcasters too.
All right. A lot of impact there. There's nothing like performance though, right? It's like real estate, location. Neil, is there another dimension to this?
Yeah, I think James and Kristen touched on two aspects that are really important. One is, for performance, you either perform or you don't. So it's pretty black or white, right? But, these publishers want to attract brand advertisers, and the brand advertisers are looking for impressions. So they're trying to reach as many people as they can. So if they're thinking that they're buying invalid impressions, they're going to be hesitant to use podcasts. So, it is harmful for the industry. It's harmful for the growth of podcasts, and it's harmful for the publishers. They're basically shooting themselves in the foot by buying kind of impressions that aren't really going to land. And there's already questions about what is an impression, right? Is a download an impression? Well, not really if they didn't hear the ad, right? So, I think those factors are all important.
So if a download falls in the woods and nobody hears it, it's not a download, right? So Alyssa, yeah. I imagine you guys are going to be keeping your eye on this and update us as it develops further.
Absolutely. Yeah, I will with regard to podcasts for sure. Ashley's story, obviously made a big impact, it seems like, on everyone in the industry. And it's interesting to look at it from the lens of podcasting, which is what I'll be doing as well with the digital stuff. It was more cut and dry. The trade desk told Ryan this type of thing, we consider it invalid traffic. But like you all said, with podcasts, there's still, I think, a lot of conversation to be had around, what's a download? What's a listen? How do we tell if this is something we're going to count as legitimate? So yes, I will be keeping an eye on that.
Awesome. And maybe we'll have you back as it develops further, right? Yeah.
Yeah, would love to. And
Neil, the next story is from you. And it sounds like marketers need to pay more for attention. What's that all about? Why do we need to pay for attention?
It depends on who you are, whether you should pay more for attention or not. So it's an interesting article that I picked up in Marketing Week, and it was written by Mark Ritson, and it was in response to a comment that Byron Sharp made at a conference in Australia, a B2B conference. And, to me, it's interesting on a number of levels. One, when Mark Ritson has a POV or Byron Sharp has a POV as the industry, it's something for us to listen to and, to kind of weigh the meaning of that. It's interesting to me because attention is what we're seeking to, grasp from our consumers. So we're trying to buy attention for our advertisers. And then in the audio space where we sit, we can buy terrestrial radio, we can buy smart speakers, we can buy streaming, we can buy podcasts, and there's really a gamut of opportunity, and there's a gamut of attention that is paid to the advertising. So is it worth it to pay more for podcast advertising where there's fewer commercials, where there's more of a lean in experience, where people are paying more attention? So that's the interest to me on those levels. And basically, Byron Sharp's position was, yes, you need to get attention, but should you pay more for attention? Not really. And then Mark Ritson in the article lays out, a lot of compelling data to support that it is important to pay for attention. So the ad has to be viewable. People have to be fixated on the ad. It has to, the dwell time that people are spending with the ad. So if you're spending 7.5 seconds of a 15-second watching a TV ad, is that worth more than paying, spending 1 to 2 seconds seeing an outdoor ad. And, at the end of the day, in the article, there's a pretty compelling case by Mark Ritson that, there is a correlation between attention and brand impact and brand recall. So he makes the case that that is important to pay more for attention. And for me, I concur. I think that we have to kind of think about that every day in our business. When does it make sense to pay more for advertising? And I think there's definitely instances where you do pay a premium and it's worth it to pay that premium.
And from like a definition of terms standpoint, when they're discussing attention and when you're talking about attention, like what does that mean?
I mean, at the root of it is the ad scene. And I think it's the attention is, it's, you have to see the ad for less than 1 second, right? Way less than 1 second to count as attention. So there are ads that are unviewable, right? So you can't pay attention to those unviewable ads. So you shouldn't pay for those ads. But the benchmark for what attention is very low.
And when you translate that to an auditory experience, how do you see attention in that regard?
From an audio perspective, I mean, the way I look at it is, I just read this morning that the average CPM for a podcast is around $25. If I'm buying terrestrial radio, which has, much higher reach than podcasts, I can buy an impression for a fraction of that. So, for podcasts, is it worth it to pay $25 on an average for CPM, where I have lower reach potential than terrestrial? So that's a big question, but we know from performance that it is, it works. So we drive better performance typically through podcasts than we do through terrestrial, and we're doing it in a very uncluttered environment. So there's fewer ads, we're standing out more. So, that's the fundamental question and, thing that we need to think about. Is it worth it to pay more for attention? And as it relates to audio, I believe so, especially with podcasts, just given the experience that consumers have with podcasts.
And if I could interject on that one too, I think when you compare terrestrial to podcast, you're also looking at engagement, because the average podcast listener is actively engaging with the podcasts that they're listening to, right? So it's something where it's a lean in listener. They're actively listening to what's happening within the body of the podcast, versus terrestrial radio, which largely becomes background noise, especially when you get into the more music formats, right? I think what we see a lot of times too is that podcast listeners often reflect the behaviors of like a traditional news talk radio listener, where they're actively engaged, they're actively listening and paying attention. And I think in that instance, it is worth paying more, because we know that they're not just listening to podcasts as background noise. That means that the ads aren't just going to become background noise as well. So I think in that case, it is worth more.
And James and Alyssa, how do you guys look at that as the CPMs in podcasting and podcasting as a lean in medium? Is it really different from other mediums?
That's what I've heard from the brand side with people that I talk to. You guys would know better than me. You talk to more brands than I do, but that's something I hear, from buyers and sellers when we talk about podcast advertising is, yes, Kristen's point about it being leaned in. I think that is the appeal for a lot of brands that are trying it out, is that they know that podcasters are turning this stuff on and they're opting in and they're really engaged with the hosts. So I think it almost makes sense that there's a higher CPM associated with that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And how high I think is probably debatable, but there definitely should be a CPM on there, only because you have someone who's leaning in and actively choosing that. So if you're in the car, you may just want some background noise. You're going to turn on a music radio station and just zone out. Whereas if you're listening to a podcast, you're actually selecting and going through the trouble, finding it, favoring it, listening to it, hitting play, getting your earphones, and then experiencing that podcast, which it just leads to a very different experience than just listening to the radio or just tuning into some kind of streaming service. So I do think that you do get a much more highly engaged audience, and depending on the network, much lower spot load. So meaning instead of a commercial break on the radio going 8, 9 commercials deep, you're getting 1, maybe 3 ads in a podcast, which makes it that much more memorable.
Exactly. And that dovetails perfectly into the next story that I brought, that podcast episodes are getting shorter. So Raphonic analyzed 2.5 million podcasts. Raphonic is a podcast database that allows you to search podcasts by listener numbers, gender skew, engagement. So they have this massive database, and they looked at what is the average length of a podcast episode. And it turns out that the average top performing podcast, that'd be a podcast with 10,000 listeners per episode or more, is 37 minutes. And they release an episode every 5 days. So we definitely want to shoot for 37 minutes here today, guys. I think that's one takeaway from this. Longer podcast episodes are less common every year. They did call out that the top history podcasts have the longest delay between episodes. They're also very long episodes. So any Dan Carlin hardcore history fans out there, you know how long he makes us wait, but it's so worth it. It is so worth it. And fiction podcasts are longer, which kind of makes sense, right? Like when you look at television as a medium, the sitcoms, 30 minutes. Well, why is that? It's because if you go any longer than 30 minutes, you've introduced so many problems with your characters that now it kind of gets a little bit more serious in order for them to solve it. So it can all be for 30 minutes, and your dramas are 60 minutes and longer, especially as we've gone to streaming. But when I think of it, podcast becoming 37 minutes long, it's interesting. Podcast continues to evolve sort of into its broadcast predecessors. Even though it is new and different, it's on demand, there's still these things that we've done for 100 years that are kind of these rules that are coming to apply. But as of summer 2022, podcast showed an average of 4 to 9 ads per 30 to 60 minutes. Like you were saying, James, it's a lower spot load, while radio has 15 to 18 minutes. And depending on how you slice that can be 30 plus different ads. TV and YouTube have 12 to 15 ads per 30 minutes. And then I think it's interesting that, the average length of a YouTube video is 11.7 minutes. And some of those are going to have 2 to 3 ads. So if you just think of the number of ads per minute of content, there's still such this premium in podcasts that it's a low spot load. And I think even though the episodes are getting shorter, it's something that we say here at Oxford Road a lot, which is save the live reads. Like in that case, if the episodes are getting shorter and the spot loads are probably going to continue to creep up past 4 and 9 ads, it's just sort of inevitable. It's going to become more like radio. Then you need to fight harder, especially at the outset of a campaign, for those live reads of the hosts where they're talking personally about their personal experience.
Yeah, to me, I think it's interesting. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that podcasts are getting shorter on average, and especially for a newer listener who may be intimidated by jumping into an hour and a half episode where it's 30 minutes. It's more manageable. It's it's less of a time commitment. So I think that there's value in that as a sampling opportunity to gain more listeners, and I think there's value in just having a variety of different lengths. If you want the 2-hour episode, then you have that opportunity. If you don't have 2 hours to spend on something, you want to spend 15 minutes, then that's available to you as well.
What about you, James? When you think about podcasts, having you've got a deep background in radio, do you see it sort of inevitably becoming radio? Do you see something different? What do you think of that entire dynamic?
I think yes and no. So I think it depends on the type of podcast. So if you're to say podcasts are becoming radio or becoming shorter because of that, I mean, if you listen to, if you really want to go Inception on this, technically radio shows chop up their show into podcasts. So they're just very digestible. So I was listening to a bit this morning, and they said, if you missed this, you can follow up, or you missed the end of our bit, you can listen on the podcast, which is kind of funny given this conversation. But I do think that if you're listening to a news program, or if you're listening to even maybe a comedy bit, those are more like radio. Those are quick hits. Even like this show, we have 30 minutes or so, and we have to hit a bunch of stories, which is just like a news talk format. But then those like true crime, or maybe in science podcasts or anything along those lines, that's more storytelling. That's less like radio. So I do think it all depends on the type of genre that you are listening to, but people do like to just have an agenda and hear what's coming up on at certain points, and that's very much like radio, which isn't a bad thing. It's just adapting to how people listen.
Absolutely. And Kristen, what are you seeing as far as spot loads go on the media side of things when it comes to shows?
We're definitely seeing the spot loads increase when it comes to podcasts. Before there would be maybe a pre-roll, there'd be 1 to 2 mid-rolls, somewhere actually in the middle, and then maybe a post-roll. That was traditionally how we saw things. Now we're starting to see, 2, sometimes 3 whole breaks with, 3, maybe even 4, ads within each of those breaks. Why is this? Well, obviously it's for sales. The networks, and they want to make, the most amount of money possible, right? And each of those are going to count. Is it great for advertisers? I think not necessarily. I think, unless you're being very strategic and negotiating your place in that each individual pod, or which pod you're getting, your clients and your ads can get lost in that shuffle. So it's definitely causing, media departments to be a little bit more strategic and tactical in how we're buying these podcasts. There are, and that's not to say this is for everyone, right? There's still a lot of podcasts out there that are holding to kind of like the more traditional method. But more and more, we're seeing those ad breaks increase, and we're going to have to adjust to go along with it.
Yeah, it seems inevitable, the monetization that the spot load is going to go up. Is it going to get to 15 to 18 minutes of every hour? Ooh,
let's hope
we hope not.
One would hope not.
Yeah, I would say, there's definitely linkage to the story about paying more for attention. And there's definitely value to me when there's, you're in an uncluttered environment. There's just a few advertisers in that environment that you're competing with to get a consumer's attention. When you're getting up to 10 to 12 minutes of advertising, then that changes the equation.
Totally. And I was looking around on this article as well in preparation, and I was kind of like, why 30 minutes? Like, why an hour? Why are things this way? And one observation was the average commute time in the United States is about half an hour. And so I'm also thinking like pandemic, post-pandemic, when we're in the pandemic and everybody, most people were inside and podcast listening is going up. It's like, who cares on the duration and whatever. But now is like, you get out there on the LA freeway and it's like, oh, we're back. Then the average time that you have to listen to your program needs to fit into your life. Alyssa, did you have any thoughts on this? I know we kind of ambled all about here, but podcast length, spot load, either of those topics.
Yeah, I think I'm still thinking about what Neil said just from a listener perspective. And I think it relates to kind of the way Kristen was talking about how the buying has to go. It has to be pretty custom, depends on the show and the brand. Just from a listener perspective, I've been thinking that there are a limited number of shows that I listen to, maybe 1 or 2 that I'm a super fan of that go, 2 hours, 2.5 hours. And for some other shows that are normally 30 minutes, if they're longer than that, and I'm busy that day, I have a lot of episodes in my feed, maybe I'm just skipping them. It takes, I think, a really special show to actually hold my attention for 2+ hours every week, just as a listener.
For sure. Yeah, there was a story about that in Pod News, that fiction podcasts, we will finish those, right? We have to hear, did they solve the problems that got set up? But tech podcasts, a lot of these other podcasts, we bail on them. So exactly what you're saying. I mean, we get it. We're all people. And so those listening habits are pretty universal. It seems like, so the market has to adjust to what people actually do. The next story, talking about the market trying to adjust here, or maybe trying to change us a little bit, is product placement in podcasts. Alyssa, how is that? How are they doing that?
Yeah, I think you actually transitioned into this one perfectly with your mention of fiction podcasts there, because that is so far, I think, the use case here. You know, you have these scripted fiction podcasts that are getting pretty popular. And, you know, maybe you have a character that's a robot or someone in space, and it's not so natural to do your typical host-read podcast ad. What do? I don't think we're in full on product placement land yet, like we're seeing with a lot of these TV shows that are just inundated with product placement. But some networks are trying out, I think, sort of a step in this direction. I spoke with Q Code recently for this story, and they're a pretty big scripted fiction network. They've done, you know, like Blackout with Rami Malek, and worked with like Gina Rodriguez and Cole Sprouse, and they have all these big name actors that are doing fiction podcasts with them. And they're trying something that they're calling in-universe ads, which is essentially, you know, again, not full on product placement, but it's a little bit different than your traditional, oh, it's just this episode is sponsored by X, or host read ad. One that comes to mind is what they did with Bud Light in their story Electric Easy, which takes place in a bar. Good fit for an alcohol product placement, I think. And they have not necessarily in the plot of the show, but an ad read at the beginning of the show that takes place in this world where they have a character walk into the bar, the Electric Easy, and they order a Bud Light seltzer and they try it and they rave review it. And it's a character in the show and it takes place in this fictional world. So yeah, it was an interesting example, I think, of something new or a new twist on podcast advertising.
Yeah, it felt almost like a ASMR thing. I mean, the way that character was like responding to the Bud Light seltzer, I was like, did he already take something harder before he drank that? Because he was like, it was ecstasy. That he's like, oh, and the colors or something. There was like some color in the seltzer. Like, yeah, I don't even know, is that a future product of theirs, or I don't even know if that's a current product.
Well, you're right with the ASMR. It's closely related to another topic I write about a lot, which is sonic branding. Like these brands, Bud Light, it's not just any sound that you're hearing with the seltzer open. Like with these companies, they have very specific sonic logos that they want to put to use in podcasts, these fiction podcasts in particular. It seems like they're just prime for that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I remember it was the Super Bowl spot. I think it was with Bush where they just did the Bush. And it just kept going. I mean, audio is so interesting, right? Because it goes inside, it's inside of us. And then you enter into the theater of the mind, but there's also that Pavlovian dimension to it that is so interesting. So if you can make them feel something good, hopefully retain that it's Bud Light seltzer, and they recall that noise. It's training, right? That's something Les Benet talks about, is that marketing is training. I guess, Neil, I've got a question for you. Like, how does somebody, measure the effectiveness of something like this to go, okay, I'm not hard selling, I don't have a promo code, how does that play out? I know it sounds like they'd worked with Veritonic to do some brand lift stuff, but how does this stuff pencil?
Yeah, I would say it's oftentimes the case where it's some kind of consumer study, a brand lift study that would be part of that. It can be very difficult to measure, to be honest. So, that will be a challenge to prove the effectiveness of product placement. I do think that where it's organic in the storyline, then it totally makes sense. And, and it can be part of, and if it's part of a larger program, so it's, supported by advertising, then I think that whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So to me, that brand lift, the performance, being able to measure direct and indirect actions from the podcast are all really important to prove out the effectiveness of product placement.
And it's like, you just like some advertiser to just like go for it, be blatant with it, like, my neck is so sore, I'm sure glad I got this Theragun with promo code, whatever it is, just lean into it.
On that point, I think with the advent of video capabilities on podcasts, that opens up a whole new world, not only just from live reads, I mean, and endorsements, like showing, like I have my Quip gum here, like showing my Quip gum and how easy it is to use. But, we've selfishly, we've approached some people too, like, oh, if you have an actual desk, like, can you put the products on here, and does that way they become integral. Now, again, only if it makes sense. We're not going to ask them to like hang a pair of underwear on there for one of our clients, but if it makes sense and it's active, I think that the video component actually helps tell the story, just like the Coca-Cola cups used to be on American Idol. It just kind of is part of the set at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh,
I'm gonna say, I've assumed anytime I've watched a podcast on YouTube where there's where they're drinking something, hint, or having a beer, I've assumed that that's through a relationship and it's through product placement.
Yeah, and at Oxford Road, we for years, haven't been here since before the beginning. We only advertise products and services we believe in and would use ourselves. And finding that direct and personal connection with the hosts is what we're all about. And so it is very natural then for them to integrate it into what they're showing on camera or what they're talking about. And I also think, like Alyssa, like you're saying, what are other ways to be creative about integrating some sort of mnemonic or sonic branding into the spot to make positive associations with the brand. And some brands need more positive association than others. Some already might have a bunch of positive associations. It depends on where you come down on, for instance, the brand of the Central Intelligence Agency, which has just come out with a podcast. So how's their branding going? How's that podcast, Kristen?
It's funny. Everybody now officially has a podcast, especially a government agency that we probably never thought would have a podcast, but now the CIA actually does have a podcast. And what they're saying is, they want to dispel the glamorous, view of what we think the CIA actually is. Everybody watches these movies about CIA operators and thinks it's like this glamorous work, and they're traveling the world and they've got all these, alternate identities and it's all craziness. And really what they're doing is kind of breaking down and educating the public and saying, hey, here's actually what our core mission is, and here's what we're capable of. And, and sharing some redacted stories and things that they can actually, kind of open up and share. Maybe it's like years later, or, just kind of look under the hood a little bit of what the CIA is. The current director, Bill Burns, is the featured guest on episode 1. And, we talked earlier about the length of podcasts. These ones are going to be great. They're going to be 15 to 30 minutes long. So they're super snackable. And, I don't think there's like a really big hot take on this, but I do think it's going to, in a way, open up maybe more government agencies to be a little bit more open with the public, and use this kind of as a way to communicate in a real tangible way with listeners. And if for advertisers, assuming we can get ourselves in there, there's definitely a lot of room for some really interesting alignments.
And Alyssa, when you look at this with a government agency stepping into podcasting like this, like, do you see this as is this PR? Is this recruitment? Is this, oh, hey, we've seen what a fabulous job the Navy SEALs have done of, making themselves out to be Captain America. And it's, Navy SEAL, you're a Navy SEAL, I'm a Navy SEAL, everyone's a Navy SEAL. Like, where do you see this coming from for the CIA?
Everything is PR to a journalist too. So it's definitely, I see it as a branded podcast, and everyone's got one. I would be interested, like Kristen said, or other government agencies going to do this. I have written about the agency podcast, meaning the ad agency podcast, like this one. IPG has one. Edelman has several. So maybe there is a trend story one day about the government agency podcast. But yeah, I think it's a branding effort. It's a PR effort. They're presumably interviewing their internal folks. And I can't imagine that they would chat about anything other than sort of success stories and things like that. So if they can get people to tune in, it seems like, yeah, easy money PR effort there.
And what about, this one, anytime we've talked about it, or even in prep for the show, like it brings a whimsical smile to everyone's face. So I do want to hear what James and Neil, what do you guys think of with this CIA podcast?
I think it's interesting. I mean, anytime you can get inside access to something that's so closed off, or I mean, I have not listened, but I'm sure they're not dispelling secrets of America in that podcast. But it definitely catches the pop culture's eye. I mean, it was on actually they featured it on Saturday Night Live over the weekend on Weekend Update. So it's made its way into the pop culture world already. But I'll probably listen into 1 or 2 episodes to see what they have to say.
I think Alyssa probably has the the best take from a PR perspective. So it's good PR for the CIA. And I think in a day and age where, it's hard to recruit new employees, it's probably a good employee recruitment tool to really just better understand what the CIA does. I think we probably all have a picture that's based on watching movies, watching Jason Bourne, which probably isn't quite the glamorous life that a regular CIA agent lives. So it's giving probably a more rounded perspective on what the CIA does and does for America.
And one note on it, this is also from Pod News, that also a great, fantastic show to tune into on All Things Podcast. They noted that it's hosted by Transistor, which is a podcast hosting company from Canada, which is just kind of comical. The CIA's show is hosted by a Canadian company. So there you have it.
I guess they trust the Canadians, right?
Yeah, this will be a good one to watch and see if other government agencies do the same. I mean, it's not, I think of the Trader Joe's podcast as far as like a benchmark of like a branded podcast that people mention and does good things for that brand. And the CIA, just like you said, Neil, is a brand just like others that also does have a lot of appeal to it. And it's how do things really work inside of there. And you think of, jesting earlier, but with the Navy SEALs for years now, how, I thought this is a top secret operation, but by getting more of their story out there, it's able to make them more present, like you said, in the public's mind. So there is a podcast out there for everybody. Turns out, seems like it. So thank you guys for joining the Media Roundtable today. I think we might clock in right at about 37 minutes. I started my stopwatch a little bit late, but we might just be perfect there as far as the average duration of a podcast episode. So we'll thank you guys all for being on the show. This show is dedicated to our mission of mobilizing marketers to advance truth and civility in journalism. We want you not just to know the news, but use it for good. If you're a marketer looking to balance business objectives with your brand values, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. Thank you again to our guests and to Bianca, Kristen, Kyle, Spencer, Jennifer, and the team at Podcast One. As always, influence responsibly.